a lot of people view housing as an investment, right? And I often say I don't view my primary residence as an investment. I consider my home that I live in to be an investment in the same way that I consider a good pair of boots to be an investment. I'm going to get use out of them. They're going to provide value to me. I'm going to, if I maintain them well, I'm going to have them for a long time and I'm going to enjoy them. But I don't expect to 40 years down the line sell my used boots and use that to fund my retirement.
Welcome to the Tom Storey Show with Steve Karrasch and Tom Storey, where we discuss everything real estate or whatever else is on our minds.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Tom Storey Show, your weekly real estate roundup podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Steve, I continue to say this, but we are approaching 5,000. There's a very good chance when this episode comes out, we could be there on the podcast channel, which started from its infancy at zero, like what, a year and a half ago? Has it been longer than that now?
We're almost 2 years. 2
years? Okay. Look at that. This just shows that consistency means anybody can do it if you just do it long enough. If you're listening on the audio platforms, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today's guest is Millennial Moron. He blew up on TikTok, almost 200,000 followers there. Your Instagram's huge, and now he's taken over YouTube. And me and Steve probably have about a week left until you crush us both in subscribers. So welcome to the program, man. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, I was telling you before offline is that I talk to my team members and people in my office when I book people for the show. And a lot of the times they kind of just blankly look at me like, who? And when I said your name, every single one was like, oh, I know him. He's awesome. So you've really put a footprint out there, man. People know who you are. Yeah,
it's always good feedback to get, I guess.
So give me a bit of a background on, I'm sure there's some people watching this that maybe for the first time being introduced to you. What's your story? Like, how did you get here where you started making content about, the Canadian economy, real estate, politics, all that?
Well, the way it all started was, 10 years ago, I had this idea when there were a lot of news articles floating around about all these rundown, tear down Vancouver homes that were for sale for millions of dollars, right? And obviously they were development properties, but sure. I started thinking, what's the most luxurious type of real estate you can get? Probably a private island. That's kind of the most prestigious thing I could think of. And I wanted to see how many of those rundown Vancouver properties it would take to get a private island for yourself. And turns out the answer was one. And I really sat on that idea for a really long time because I couldn't figure out a funny way to put it together or a way that I thought was worth publishing.
Yeah.
But just a year ago, I was thinking about real estate again because of interest rates going up, which was obviously a big deal. And I had been doing some other video work for some other channels that are much less popular. Okay. But I thought, with the green screen things on TikTok, you can actually present this in a way that's, quick and funny and is worth doing. So I gave it a shot and it kind of blew up overnight. And then as time went on, people started asking what's going on in Canada. And I started explaining to the best of my ability, I guess, because it is something I've been following for, 12 years or so.
Were you surprised how quickly that took off on TikTok? Like how many people started really liking that type of content?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first day or two, I was joking with my friends about how I had made some pronunciation error and how all 12 of my viewers on the video were going to be very disappointed. But then the next day I checked and it was up to something like 200,000.
Crazy. Now, You've taken a different approach than me and Steve, where like we started putting content out there because it is a direct driver to business for us, right? Like that's just the truth. We put out content. That's how people find out who we are. And as I told you before we started recording, we are the enemies. We are real estate agents. For you, is this simply just for fun at this point? Is there any end goal here? Are you going to monetize this? What does this look like?
I've got a little bit of monetization coming in on YouTube, which I guess is good because I've been spending a lot of hours on it and it would be hard to justify otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be good to grow it into a larger business, but the thing is, I'm not really selling anything, right? I'm just talking about these issues in a way that is connecting with people. And I think for me, this is something I've been trying to talk to people about for, again, 10 years or so. And I think we've reached a point where it has become so obvious that there's a problem here to so many people that people are finally ready to listen and to hear about some of the things that have led to the situation that we're in now, rather than just, taking it for granted as kind of the new normal.
Right.
Like, people are very frustrated and they want to understand, how did we get here? How do we get out? I think it's a lot easier to explain how we got here than what's going to happen next. But I think it is worth knowing, at least.
If we were to give like 3 bullet points to people, that is like, how did it get to this point where even I started selling real estate 10 years ago. I was meeting with people then. They would buy a really nice 1+den condo in downtown Toronto in a great area, $300,000. Like, that was very normal. Today it's $650, pretty much it's doubled. So how did we get here? What happened? I know we talk about now like population and immigration, all those kind of things, but this was the wave was starting long before the pandemic happened. So for you, like, how did we get to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you want to narrow it down to 3 reasons, I have talked about this before a bit I think there is kind of a cycle of 3 things that's been happening over the last 15, 20 years, maybe even longer. But there's been access to cheap debt, which drives prices higher, right? That leads people to believe that they need to get into housing now before prices keep going up further, and that home prices will always go up no matter what. And then we have government interference of, making new regulations or giving other ways to give people access to cheap debt. And we have this cycle that we've been going around and around because people have the idea that housing is the bedrock of their entire finances, which for a lot of people, they have made it that. And the government doesn't want to allow that to crumble underneath them. And so they try to support it as much as they can. But I think eventually we've seen now that we're running out of room to be able to do that. I mean, if interest rates go up, which was never not going to happen, right? Like, the free money era couldn't last forever.
Right.
And that kind of really pulls the rug out from under the whole thing. Once debt becomes more expensive, all these huge debt loads we've accrued against the huge prices of real estate suddenly becomes much, much more expensive to carry. And something's got to give there.
One of the things that me and Steve have been talking about recently, and Steve, I'd love if you can jump in on this, because we talk about, like, we are still very much meeting with people every single day that are purchasing properties, selling properties, and the internet's a whole different thing, right? You hear views from everybody, and a lot of it's anonymous. But one thing I will say is absolutely true is the people I'm helping right now, almost all of them already had equity in a property that's allowing them to move to the next one because they've owned for the last 10 years, and everything you just talked about has put them in a position that they can make that upwards jump. Do we have a problem now if the only people moving, it's just this game of musical chairs where if the first-time home buyers can't get in, does the market crumble at some point? Does that start to eventually impact everybody else?
Well, I think it's absolutely going to impact everybody else. You have to feed the bottom of the market, right? You have to feed the bottom of the market. Otherwise, you have nobody else entering the market. It's as simple as that. It's the way it's always been. I don't think that has changed. I have noticed a tremendous slowdown in first-time buyers.
First-time home buyers are down.
For our team. And it's strange because a year ago, not a year ago, 9 months ago, when money was more expensive than it is now, we actually had more first-time buyers. So I think that's likely a function of maybe they're not being able to save the down payment, possibly, or maybe it's just the negative news that says, hey, it's a bad time. And I do think that is an overall effect on the marketplace. And that's why sentiment will be probably changing whenever that first rate cut happens, and probably falsely changing. It shouldn't be changing, but it probably will change.
What do you think? RBC is now saying they're pretty much saying it's going to happen in June. I'm not convinced. When that 25-point cut happens, should Canadians be excited, or is it just going to be a news headline that gets people talking?
I think it's going to get people talking. I think there are going to be people who are anticipating that being the start of a hot market. So you might see a bit of a dead cat bounce, I guess you could say, when that happens, like people trying to rush in of, this is the moment. But realistically, I think as rate cuts start happening, the thing that's going to signal a rate cut is a weakening economy, right? We're going to see, obviously, we've seen productivity declining, our GDP per capita going down for quite some time now, and unemployment has been rising. And that's what drives inflation down. And then that's what drives rate cuts to happen to try and re-stimulate the economy. But that doesn't exactly bode well for getting into a market that requires a lot of money. And to your previous point about only people who already have home equity being able to buy. I mean, that's true for even first-time buyers as well, right? I think there was I forget who did the report, but the biggest predictive factor in owning a home now as a younger person is whether or not your parents own property, and it becomes more likely the more properties they owned. So we could end up in a situation where, this kind of faltering of the middle class among young people leads to basically having no bottom end of the market. Or, in theory, you could have a situation where society is kind of divided into two classes, where you have the tenant class basically, and then the landed gentry who already own land, and it becomes much, much harder to move between those two groups.
I watched the last video you put out, which, by the way, the title was amazing. I felt personally victimized. It said, "Dear realtors, nobody has any money." Great, like very well done. Kudos. And the end of that video, when you had the pause, I'm not going to give anything away. I'll let people go watch it. But when we talk about government, and Steve's openly not a fan of JT, I'm kind of like, I'm not an open criticizer. I think he's got a very difficult job. I think in a year from now, or just past a year from now, at the end of 2025, there's a good chance we have a change in government. Does that mean anything for housing? Is anything actually going to change if the person in charge changes? Are the policies any better?
I don't think anything is going to change just from a changing of the guard at Parliament. I think it's a good start. I think the current government is overdue to be flushed out for someone else.
Sure.
But at the same time, I think if we as citizens are not having the right conversations and thinking deeply about what policies we want and need for the long term, and very specifically start thinking more of housing as an essential need for everyone and something that we need to cultivate a legacy for in the long term. If we keep just trying to do all these short-term Band-Aid solutions, then that's what's going to be reflected in policy, because that's what's going to get people elected. They want people to be seeing results immediately, even if they're kind of illusory results, right? It's
what are those? What are those things? What can we do? Like what? I mean, the realtors just come out and say, "Oh, we need more supply. We need more supply. We need interest rates to come down." Which I agree with you. Low interest rates are not the solution; they're the problem, right? But what can be done by any level of government for a long-term solution other than kicking everybody out of the country so there's more houses?
Yeah, so that's a really long conversation to have. I think there's things happening at all different levels of government right now, and some are good and some are bad. One example that I've been talking about in Calgary, because I've been following their affordable housing plans since they kind of, it first came up for a vote last year, but they just did, they eliminated single family detached zoning in the city.
That happened like a few days ago, right? Or like yesterday.
So, yeah, they just had the vote, and they've upzoned the base district to allow for row housing, right? And that's something that's not going to have an effect right away, right? No. But over the course of 50 years, how long did it take for exclusionary zoning to get us into problems in places like Vancouver and Toronto, right, where you can't redevelop a property into anything else other than a bigger, more expensive detached home that one family can live in, right? So that's one thing, and we could even extend that to something like presumptive rezoning based on land value density, right? As a neighborhood becomes older and more valuable, then just unless you have a very good reason not to, keep upzoning it naturally to more density. And then what you tend to see is you get a mix of different housing forms, or even commercial properties being put into the mix, and you end up with these more dense urban type neighborhoods. As the city expands outward, you get more density closer to the core, just from the market, the way the market demands it to be. So that's one thing. Another thing we could be doing is encouraging more purpose-built rentals. I think the way we set up our policies in a lot of ways has, like, people really like rent control in Ontario in the sense of it protects them in the short term, right?
Yeah, long term, I don't think it's that helpful.
No, because long term, what happened is developers started putting in, just condo builds that they build and then sell and kind of wash their hands from and walk away, right? And that leads to an incentive to build kind of, flimsier, less durable buildings that can be sold at a higher price point, as opposed to seeing those old, 70s, 80s style apartment buildings, which are very sturdy, very efficient, and are even today a key source of affordable housing for people. Yeah. Right. I've lived in apartments like that for quite a few years. And that was good, especially when I was living in Ontario and I could live for a few years in one place without major rent increases suddenly. But at the same time, I think it would be more important to have more of that built than it is to kind of have almost the obligation to stay in one place so that your rent remains affordable. I think it would be better for rent to be affordable and people still to have a choice of where to live and the ability to move, because that's better for the overall economy and for people's lives so that people aren't stuck in one place.
Do you have any concern though that because we have a lot of purpose-built rentals coming to downtown Toronto right now, like very fast and furious. Any concern though that they're just all owned by these big corporations, and as it stands right now, they are not under rent control based on the Ontario rules, and you'd think people would know that, but people don't know that when they're moving into them. Like, are we just going down a path where all this housing is just going to be owned by the big companies or the government? Is that worrying?
I mean, to some extent, any giant apartment building is going to be owned by a big company because
Agreed.
They're big and expensive, right?
Yeah.
And I think, in a lot of ways, people are concerned about big corporations and particularly REITs getting involved in the market because they often have incentive to, for example, buy up older buildings and then renovate them so that they can rent them for larger amounts of money. But getting more purpose-built rental into the supply is not going to be a bad thing. Right now, we are in a big vacancy crunch. Vacancy rates are record lows pretty much. So even if you want to move, even if you have the money to move, you might not even be able to find a place to move to. So
Right.
We need to get back into a more balanced market where there is a bit of vacancy and landlords have to compete with each other for tenants rather than just the other way around. Mm-hmm. Now, to your point, there is probably a role to be played for the government in terms of affordable housing being built as well.
Yeah.
Something that we've heard Pierre Poilievre say pretty frequently is that in Canada, we built less homes, in 2022 or whatever it was than we did in 1972. And one of the things that he doesn't like to bring up in that statement is that 1972 was also the peak of federal investment in affordable housing in terms of the number of units being built through federal programs. And then through the Mulroney era, got cut down to almost nothing. Chrétien campaigned on restarting those programs and then didn't. And then all through the Harper years, it remained near zero. And now recently there's been a little bit of increase in it, but not nearly even at the same amount that we had 50 years ago, even though our population has doubled. So, and if you look at a lot of other countries where they have taken action on housing affordability and are actually having some success, that's usually a significant part of it is either the government building or subsidizing or providing land for affordable housing units. And that pretty much always takes the form of rentals. I think we've got way too much focus here on home ownership being the be-all, end-all of success for everyone. But if you have an affordable place to live, I think it's okay if you're renting. I don't think home ownership is just the only possible way to have stable finances, even though that's kind of how it's viewed here.
Hey, real estate agents, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Are you proud of your current website? If there's any hesitation in your answer, what I want you to do is go to realtyninja.com/Tom. They provide amazing websites for the real estate industry at an affordable cost. Steve has been using them for over a decade. realtyninja.com/Tom. Let's chat more about that actually, because the one thing, actually, Steve, I'll let you just take this over. So on the rental side, I know sometimes you get comments on your channel with people that are older that rented their whole lives that got stuck. You start talking.
He wants me to go realtor on you right now. That's what he's saying. So here's the issue. What I have with what you're saying. One, I want less government, not more government. That's probably better for everybody. I don't think that the government solving the housing problem is going to solve the housing problem. I just don't. I think we're going to end up with Eastern European looking communist bloc housing, which is great. It puts people in with roofs over their heads, but the overall society has an issue with that. So if we do think that our goal might be the wrong word. If we do end up saying that renting is just fine and that should be okay for you, and by the way, the government's going to help you do that, and then what? So you alluded to, well, you can do other things with your money. What we know, and I'm dealing with it right now, multiple multiple listings actually that are coming down the pipe here for me, is there are lots of people selling their homes because they got into business, or they played the stock market, or they've done something else where they failed miserably at it and their house is actually the only thing bailing them out. So I don't think from a real estate agent's point of view, we should be pushing people to pay rent, because they're probably going to be really crappy with their money on the other side of things. It would be nice to think that we all sit at home and become business owners, and that we all do amazing investing, and that we're going to invest in something. But what? More businesses fail than realtors fail. And something like 90% of realtors fail. So I don't...
We don't have a great success rate.
We don't have a great success rate. But like, that's where I feel like, sure, in theory, this might all sound nice, but I don't actually think it's going to be better in the end. And I think we should find ways to actually help people get in and own their homes. Does that make sense? Like, coming from a big bad realtor point of view?
I see what you're saying. And I think, yes, it is advantageous to get people into owning their homes, right? But I think the approach that we've taken is, I think it's called Goodhart's Law. Have you heard of that? Where when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, right, where if you have some metric that you say like more of this is good, if you make that your target from a regulatory perspective, then it's not even a good measure of what you're doing anymore, right? So we can say, yes, it's good to get more people into homeownership, right? But the reason homeownership represented financial stability for a lot of people is because they had money to save up and they had, decent jobs and whatever. People who were in a position to be homeowners were people who were already financially stable, right? Like, homeownership was a result of financial stability. So the way to get more people into homeownership would be to improve the overall economy, right? To make sure people have better jobs and to make sure that housing that you can buy is widely available. Instead, the approach that was taken in first the US and on an ongoing basis in Canada is they wanted to just push more people into homeownership and hope that that would lead to financial stability. So they made it easier to get access to debt. And then you got more people buying houses. And of course, in the US, in the run up to the 2008 financial crisis, you saw the homeownership rate increasing. But they didn't actually have the real economic activity and real financial stability to support that. So it eventually unwound. I think the same thing is happening in Canada, except we're already starting to see the homeownership rate decline, and we're seeing properties getting concentrated into the hands of investors rather than first-time buyers. So, yes,
But
I do think
isn't that kind of a result, though, of the tightening, right? So, like, it's not easier now to buy real estate today than it has been in my whole 16 years of selling real estate. When I got in the business in 08, 09, 2010, 2011, like, if you had 30% down and could fog a mirror, they didn't check incomes, right? They had 40-year amortization. They had zero down payments. So I think from my point of view, all of this tightening that happened, like, Canadian market has been tightening consistently. Now, with the big, huge caveat of, oh yeah, let's go down to an overnight rate of 0.25% for 2 years too long, right? Outside of that, the stress test, all of these things are making it harder and not easier. So I don't really believe that that is the case in Canada. I think that it is a result of there's so many people flooding in, right? Like, last year, not this year. I'm going to say not for sure 2022, even past the peak of the market, the majority of my first-time buyers, the majority of all of my buyers were not Canadian citizens. They were permanent residents. So when you do have that amount of people, is sucking up the inventory the right term? I don't know. But I think we could have been in a better balance if we had not had so many people added, which is obviously a pretty easy statement to make, right? But I don't see it where we are actually in an easier time to buy real estate now than we have been over the previous years.
No, we're not. And it's because money has gotten a lot more expensive, right?
Yeah.
And I think I see a lot of these things as symptoms of the same problem, which is that when money became really cheap, right? Like you said, when we had 40-year amortization, zero down, really low interest rates, it was easy to buy, right? It was easy to take on a huge amount of debt and buy a home. And then, rates ended up staying lower for a long time. And so that didn't really come back to bite those people. But a problem that we have been growing into over the past 15 years is that we have shifted a lot of our investment away from productive capital, like machinery or equipment, or investment into worker training or whatever, and it's gone into unproductive capital, like real estate, which I know it's a big.
No, you're right.
In Canada, but it just it sits there and it doesn't make anything. It's just there, and that in turn has kind of weakened the overall economy. It's reduced worker productivity. And I think that's also something that's been driving some of the rapid increase in non-permanent residents that we've been seeing in the past few years, is that we've kind of run out of room for businesses to borrow money, and they can't afford to pay people what they need to live. So we're trying to solve the problem by borrowing people instead. And I think it's another, just yet another short-sighted decision. It's a lot of businesses trying to say, okay, well, we can't afford people, we can't retain people, so we'll just bring in a cheaper, more easily exploitable labor force. But that's not good for anyone. It's not good for the people who are here now. It's not good for the people who are coming here now and in the future. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious that that is a big problem. But these are things that we've never had limits on. It's just recently that it's really, really taken off.
So this is going to be my new favorite term. Instead of borrowing money, now we're borrowing people. This is great. I love that. I appreciate it.
And they're talking about reducing the number of non-permanent residents, right? Which, from our perspective, if we're looking at it as just numbers, yeah, it seems good. But at the same time, these are people who were enticed to come to Canada through government marketing programs and through recruiters in their own countries. And a lot of them were given the promise of, if you're here for a few years, then it'll be really easy to get permanent resident status and there's opportunity and everything for you here. And then they're finding out that, the job conditions are poor, the economic opportunity is poor, the cost of living is through the roof, and now they might not even be able to stay even under all of those conditions. Right?
Do you think they were being sold something
being affected?
Were they being sold something like that did just get worse since they got here? Or were they being sold a dream that was never true?
I absolutely think they're being sold a dream that was never true. There was a really good article, and I want to do a deep dive on the whole thing in a much longer video, but there was a good article called The Shadowy Business of International Education, which is largely about the international student program. And this was written years ago, right? Before even the latest explosion in our non-permanent resident numbers. And it was about how recruiters, primarily in India, were being given kickbacks by, public-private partnership colleges in Canada to find people, not even from affluent families, but from rural farming families in India, and being convinced that going to Canada was going to be great and that, your kid could go there, get an education at a prestigious school, get a good job, send money back. So a lot of people were either selling or mortgaging agricultural land that had been the family for generations for the chance to give their kid a better life. And then they find out that they paid a lot of money to a recruiter. They're paying a lot of money to a college in a strip mall, and they're essentially getting no real opportunity out of it. And they're living in conditions that may be, worse than what they had in India. It's a very bad situation of a lot of people being tricked. And we're essentially, we're stealing from the poor and giving to ourselves. It's not good at all.
You know how you guys are both know this, in YouTube Studio, when you see recent subscribers, it'll put the people at the top that have the biggest channels that follow you. I don't know if you can see that in the back end. I recently saw when I was 100,000, I wonder who this person is. I clicked on it. The entire channel was dedicated to these colleges. And the biggest videos were the colleges with the highest 95% rate of getting accepted. And this massive channel all based, and all the comments were thank you so much, I'm thinking about doing this. And this has been going on for a long time. And not that this person's doing anything wrong necessarily, but it just shows you how much interest there are from other countries coming to Canada. And you think it's now going to tail off a bit because, everyone has TikTok. Other than me, I'm the weird one that doesn't have it on my phone
I don't
anymore.
have TikTok.
Okay, fine. But Steve's old.
I'm
Steve,
400.
are you a millennial technically, or no?
Give me I don't know if I should call you Millennial or Mr. Moron. Usually I call Tom Moron, so this is nice. What is the Millennial cutoff year? And I will tell you.
90.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, on the, I think it's 95 on the.
No, the other side of the cutoff, Tom, not Gen Z cutoff. Come on.
I'm going to say 84.
Okay, well then I'm not. I thought it was 80, and I'm actually born in 80, so I think I'm right on the verge.
Well, I don't know. I don't think it matters.
How did you come up with that name?
I just kind of figured that's what people were going to call me anyway.
You got ahead of the trolls?
Yeah. In fact, that's one of my favorite things is when, some boomer says like, oh, this guy's a moron, all right. And it's appropriate name for him. And I'm like, yeah, good job insulting me using the name that I gave to myself on purpose.
The insult I've already done. Yeah. So the troll thing for you must be fun in the opposite manner it is for us, right? Because the market's always crashing on our channels. It's always, we're terrible people. And then once in a while, I'll see like one of these like more of a doom and gloom channel that's out there that's just talking about how everything's terrible and everything's going to crash and everything. And then there's just as many people commenting on that channel talking about, oh yeah, another market crash coming. Hey, like I wish like maybe we could switch supporters and then we could all have positive comments to ourselves.
But that's the thing. People don't comment usually if they totally agree with everything they're watching.
Yeah.
Like they want to comment if you've said something that they're like, oh, I don't know if I feel about that, then they'll comment on it. How have you found dealing with the comments on? I mean, you're getting tons of views.
I mean, yeah, a lot of people tell me to just ignore the trolls and whatever.
It's hard though, eh? It's hard, right?
I don't get into arguments with people because I think it's a waste of time to try and argue in a comment section, but I do sometimes farm those comments for content.
Right?
Smart. Like I'll make a video to respond to it. If it's kind of a topic I wanted to talk about anyway, then I was presenting it kind of as a response. I don't do it as much anymore because I don't want to get into individual beefs. Like that was something I did a little bit early on and it resulted in some popular videos. But I also, I started feeling weird that because my channel was growing so quickly, I was kind of singling some people out in that regard. Like anytime you make a response to a specific person, that will tend to, if you're a popular creator, bring down a lot of hate on that person. Like one realtor who was leaving a lot of angry comments on my videos very early on. It was funny to write some jokes back and forth about it, but then a few people went and left her bad Google reviews, and I was like, well, so I was trying to find those people and reach out to them directly and say, like, can you please take this review down? If you haven't used their services, this is someone's actual livelihood. It's not just an internet fight, right? Like, don't leave fake reviews for people.
If you're a real estate agent in Ontario, you're well aware of what TRESA is and the new RICO information guide. And explaining that guide to your clients is of absolute importance and is mandatory. Now, we've been using an additional resource that we got from TRESAvideo.ca. It's been really helping our team have that conversation with potential buyers and potential sellers from the very beginning. Check out TRESAvideo.ca to learn more. We have one like that where I figured out it was a fake review and made up some situation, and I looked it back and found they're one of the people trolling all my videos in the comments. I'm like, come on, man. Like, it's just tough when you're running a real business and working your ass off every day that someone that just doesn't like you online would go that far, right?
Yeah, so hence part of why I don't use my real name.
Yeah, and I asked you before, like you're now very well known. Are you getting stopped on the street and people are just kind of winking at you, or what's going on?
Sometimes, yeah. Like yesterday, I was out at a pizza place and someone came up to say they like my videos.
Nice.
Yeah. So, yeah, it happens now and then. A couple times it's happened like a few times in a day, which is weird. But yeah.
I was telling Steve my ego was big yesterday because I went to this thing in Toronto called Realtor Quest, and it's like this massive conference put on. And I got stopped for selfies and stuff. I'm like, well, are you sure? Are you sure you want to talk to me? But it was very nice. It was nice. It's just nice to see that people in real life actually like care when you're working hard on something that they're watching, right? Which is definitely something that kind of fuels us to keep going. I want to talk about your specific, you buying your first property. You've talked about that in your videos. Obviously, you talk a lot about how tough it is for people to get in. How did you actually get in? How did you buy your property?
So I had actually been in a financial position to buy a place for quite a few years, and I had kept renting because the price to rent ratio where I was living, it didn't make that much sense to buy, and I was happy where I was.
Yep.
So I was fine to keep just renting and saving. And I was in a lower cost market than, for example, the GTA. I moved out of the GTA 10 years ago.
Why did you
So
move out of GTA?
I had an opportunity for work, and I was on, I guess, like a 3-month business trip to a different city.
Okay.
But there was an opportunity to move permanently, and I liked it better. Like, it was just more my speed, so I decided to go and stay. And I'm not even working the same job anymore, but I had the opportunity to move back, turned it down, and eventually got laid off because they ran out of work for me to do, and found a different job. So. But yeah, there was one point where kind of the conditions in our building were deteriorating, like just a lot more sketchy elements moving in around us, which it happens. And the building had kind of I think kept their rent too high for too long, and a lot of older tenants moved out, and a bunch of anybody who was looking for the cheapest place in town moved in. And like the apartment above us was raided by a 10-person tactical team at one point. We thought, okay, it's probably time to move to a different apartment. And then I ran the whole time I've been doing kind of a rent versus buy spreadsheet for myself. And we had hit a point where it was kind of actually equal to own or buy, or to rent or buy. And we said, okay, we want, a little more space, a little more stability. We want to be able to have more control over the place ourselves, have a garden, like all of the positive real life aspects of homeownership, right? There are a lot. There's big lifestyle benefits. So as Steve, as you were saying, it is better to get people into owning their own homes if they're financially ready to do so. And so, yeah, we had plenty of money saved up because we both have decent jobs and we don't spend a lot of money.
Right.
And we managed to buy a place that was, within the old rule of 3 times your household income, right? Like I think we got approved by the bank for something like a $900,000 purchase price. And we were like, that's way out of the range that we want to spend. So we bought for less than half of that.
And other than your upstairs neighbors having a little bit of a party, what was the tipping point? Was it, I've now saved up this much down payment, or just like the overall, it just makes sense to do this now?
It was just an overall, it makes sense to do this now. Like we've had more than enough for the down payment because we've been saving for retirement, right? Or hopefully even an early retirement. So we each put in half of the money for the down payment, and we each had enough, even after our TFSA and RRSP were maxed, we had money left over. So we were in a very, very financially secure position to buy. And part of that is that we were in a much lower cost market, right, and that we are both, working professionals, and we're both quite frugal. So yeah, we had a lot of extra cash kicking around. And that, to me, it feels like that's a situation that in the past would have afforded you quite a bit more leeway in what you're doing. And now it's kind of, that's the situation that gets you barely into the housing market. And now our home value is out of the price range that we were looking in, right? So it's been getting harder and harder.
Could you rebuy your house now based on what it's worth?
Yeah, I think we would still be able to buy it, but it would be more of a financial strain. And I don't know if it would make as much sense financially.
It's nice to hear that someone that got into the market and benefited from the market can actually see the other sides of things and talk about, well, maybe, this has been great for me so far, but maybe this isn't going to be great for everybody else. And then you said a few times that you went to, a lower cost market than, let's say, the GTA. One of the things that we hear a lot is that I speak to a lot of people and I see the financials of like, they could buy in the GTA, but they kind of have to push to do it, or they could change their life and go elsewhere, but they're really doing everything possible to try to make it work where they grew up. And are those days just over? Is it just like you got to make the move if you want to get what you want?
I think it really depends on your personal situation. And this is a lot of, when people reach out to me for advice on home buying, I tell them, I'm not an expert on this. Like, you should consult an actual expert regarding your personal financial situation and your local market, right? Because I don't know nearly in the same granular detail of what's going on in Toronto or Vancouver as you guys do, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, like, if you have a really strong connection to the place where you grew up, if you know all your family and all your friends are there, then that's one thing. Like that's a good reason to stay. But I also think that in a lot of ways, places like Toronto or Vancouver have failed the younger generations in terms of providing them, you know, a stable, affordable place to live and enough economic opportunity to afford it. Right. And there are advantages, especially as a young person, to moving around the country or even around the world. Like will, you will make friends in other places, and your friends that you made as a kid, like some of them move away. Right. So in each of these places, you will have a social group and they will end up scattering to different places, and you will have more friends in more places. And you will feel like, you know, I don't know, you're almost more at home wherever you go because you're not so stuck and rooted in one place. But to other people, that sense of being deeply rooted in one location and having that sense of great stability is more important. But at the same time, I feel like they're getting destabilized by putting so much value in staying in one place.
Because I think having parents around too, where you grew up, is a big factor. And that you don't want to kind of leave where your family is and that stuff. And Steve, you've talked about this, where the only way you would move is if your kids moved and you'd kind of just follow them. I think what you said is actually you'd follow the one you like most.
That's what I said.
Right? So,
hopefully in 15 or 20 years, my daughters don't listen to this. But yeah, I mean, that's likely I couldn't imagine a spot where if my kids left that I wouldn't follow one of them, or if one of them stayed, maybe I'd stay and visit the other. But I mean, it's been a very Canadian thing to stay within 5 kilometers of the hospital you were born at, right? Like that is not something they have in the States. In Europe, I think it's actually very common as well. Like people stay pretty put. They travel more for vacation, but they don't, they either immigrate out completely, but there's lots of people that have their families lived in the same town for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? And Canada was kind of like that. I think it's a great opportunity for people to move and to I guess, expand the economy across the country, because there are other great cities, if you like minus 35 degrees, to live in across this country. And I think that expanding those is a good thing. Getting back to, though, what you were saying earlier about, like, the only problem is, do we have anything to contribute in those areas? Do we have any, like you said, machinery? Is there any actual, we don't need another tech hub in this country. Like, we really don't. Tech hubs can be anywhere. So when people say, oh, we're moving to Calgary and there's all these tech jobs there, it's like, I feel like Calgary doesn't need to be a tech hub, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And first of all, like, do we even need a physical hub for tech? I mean, like, one of the interesting things about Calgary as a tech hub is that it is kind of like one of the big nodes in the country for internet. But I mean, you can extend that out to almost anywhere else just with one link, right? Mm-hmm. But like, in terms of physical infrastructure, there is actually a lot of stuff there. But yeah, like, with the ability of people to work remotely, if you're doing tech type work, unless you're the actual person working at the data center doing the physical work, you don't really need to be there, right? I think with a lot of people working from home, we've experienced that, you know, very few jobs, at least, you know, in the modern economy, like, there's not as many jobs as you think where you need to be at work every day. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, if your job involves, you know, you're like, I do more field work for my job now, so I can't be anywhere in the country. But for the most part, like, I could be anywhere in the province, right?
Right.
It's not necessary for me to be where I'm at right now. But yeah, I think a lot of these companies where they're trying to get people to come back to the office every single day, they're kind of moving in the wrong direction, right? I think it'd be better if we could spread people out a little bit more and give people more freedom of where they want to live. And then that would be part of solving some of our productivity issues, is that, you know, if you don't have to have everyone living in these super expensive areas, then they don't necessarily need as high of an income to support themselves. And you can make it work a little bit better that way.
If you had to move somewhere in Canada that's not where you're currently living, would you have a number one place you'd want to go to? if your job or life took you there?
Maybe like the southern BC interior.
Okay. What about you,
Yeah.
Steve?
I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about that lately.
I
I've been
think
thinking
mine would
about
be,
where
I would go to Halifax. I love Halifax.
I've never been. Never been. I don't know.
I'm going
assuming
in,
that
I'm going in
Halifax
2
is what?
weeks.
Halifax is Vancouver Island in the east. Is that what that is? I don't know what that is.
I don't know. Let's not give them labels that they haven't asked for.
Yeah, Halifax is the eastern Canadian version of Vancouver, which is the Canadian version of Hawaii. Is it?
There you go.
How it works.
Would you
Vancouver.
ever move back to GTA one day? Would you ever consider that?
If I'm giving you an answer right now, it would be no.
Okay, that's fair.
But circumstances always change, so maybe there would
Yeah.
be something that would convince me in the future, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
How do you think of the realtors that say Vancouver and Toronto are international cities now? And
We're like New York.
We're
We're like New York.
Hey, I'll give my opinion after. I think I gave my opinion a couple weeks ago on this, but
I mean, they're fine, but they are not, the same type of cities as New York or Paris or, a lot of the places that they're compared to, right? People always say Toronto is the New York of Canada, which in a sense is true because, it's like New York, but it's a little colder and there's just not as much stuff there. And it's, things close down earlier at night. If you wanted to actually make a comparison of Toronto as like another city, I would say it's probably like Chicago. Right.
mm-hmm.
Chicago did a better
then-
job with their waterfront, though. Their pier is awesome. Toronto blew it, I think, a long time ago. Could have been amazing.
That's true.
That's my
But,
opinion.
at least currently, I think there's probably still less gun violence in Toronto. So
Yeah. Yes. That is for sure.
it comes out as a wash.
I wanted to ask you. I brought this up. By the way, I was just in Barcelona. It blew my mind. That might be my favorite city I've ever been to. It was amazing. I couldn't believe the scale of everything. Traffic was terrible, but everything else was amazing. A few episodes ago, I brought this up, and Steve kind of poo-pooed me just because the CBC put it out.
For tenant, landlord, or homeowner insurance policies, go to squareone.ca/The Tom Story Show. Use the link in the description. Save $20 when you start your free quote right now.
But they talked about the fact that, okay, for the government, whether it's JT or PP or whatever ends up happening, for them to look Canadians in the eye, because as of right now, and this will decline, I'm pretty sure it's going to decline, 66% of Canadians own a home. And for them to say, we're going to bring down housing prices, but we're also going to help other people get in, the first-time buyers, how do you say to 66% of the voters that, hey, I'm going to actively try to bring down the value of likely where most of your net worth is stored and get people to vote for them? You get what I'm trying to say with that? It's just such a difficult thing.
Yeah, and that's why it doesn't work, right?
Right.
That's the fundamental problem that we have baked ourselves into this problem, right? Is that a lot of people have made their home net worth kind of the bedrock of their entire household finances, right? And Steve, you're talking about that, and you're right. That is the situation that a lot of people are in, and a lot of people have relied on that home equity to carry them through a lot of other situations, right? So it's never going to be popular to say that, which is why I've been saying I think we need a cultural shift in how we view housing. I think a lot of people view housing as an investment, right? And I often say I don't view my primary residence as an investment, but there's kind of two meanings to the word investment, right?
Okay.
I consider my home that I live in to be an investment in the same way that I consider a good pair of boots to be an investment, right? I'm going to get use out of them. They're going to provide value to me. I'm going to, if I maintain them well, I'm going to have them for a long time and I'm going to enjoy them. But I don't expect to 40 years down the line, sell my used boots and use that to fund my retirement, right? Or sell those boots and buy a smaller pair of boots and take the difference and do something with it, right? So it can be an investment in the sense that you're investing in stability and in, an asset that you can use for your own purposes. But in terms of having your primary residence also be something that's generating a lot of wealth for you, I think that kind of puts you at odds with the idea of trying to create a society where a lot of people can be homeowners and where you want to expand that sort of middle class of people who are property owners but not property moguls, you know?
Well, I don't think most Canadians bought their house expecting it to double in value in the last 10 years. Like, I don't think they did it on purpose, right? Mm-hmm. And I've said this multiple times, so sorry to listeners that listen to every episode, but like, I got roasted online because I went on to CTV Live and did an interview. I said, I think a lot of Canadians became wealthy by mistake by buying a house and it just doubled in value. And then they clipped it and said, realtor says Canadians have become wealthy by mistake. Like, just absolutely tearing apart. But I stick by what I said. Like, I don't, but so there's that. So that happened, right? And then the dopamine or greed goes off in our heads and goes, well, I want to get a piece of that. So then all these investors came in. And a lot of people I own more than one property. So does Steve. I don't know what your situation. A lot of people own more than one property. Is that more the issue? Do you think like if you made it the down payment to buy an investment property instead of 20% minimum is 35? We've talked about that for a while. Would that have any impact on investors getting, or are investors actually not that bad and they do bring some level of housing supply?
Well, I think the kind of mom and pop investors who are buying stuff out of the secondary market or even, you know, new build condos or whatever and starting to rent those out, I think that is kind of an issue of preventing people from getting in. And like you said, that's something I've mentioned is you could increase the required down payment for an investment property, or, for example, disallow the discounted down payment, like for a primary residence, if you already own one property, right? Because that's something that we have done that's created a lot of landlords, right? As people have bought a property, it goes up in value. They now have like 20% equity. They can convert that to a rental property and buy a new primary residence for themselves with 5%. So you're buying each new property with 5% down and just waiting for the home value to increase until you have enough equity to convert the other one. Now, going back to what you said about people becoming wealthy by mistake, I think even the clipped version is correct. I think people just don't want to hear it. But in terms of people thinking they're going to get rich through their primary residence, I do think there has been some expectation of that, because that is what happened for a lot of the boomer generation, is they bought their home and their home increased in value by quite a bit, or they've been able to move into larger and larger properties as interest rates got cheaper and cheaper and home values went up and up. They have more access to capital, they have lower carrying costs for their debt, and they were able to increase their net worth on paper greatly in that sense. Now, really all they owned was a bigger and bigger house, but they've then kind of passed that down to their kids as the right way to do things. Like, I think there's been a lot of pressure on my generation to buy a home as soon as you possibly can, whether or not the actual financials of it make sense for you, because
right.
I think very few people actually sit down and work through the math and whether or not it makes sense. You know, because like the thing you always hear is mortgages build equity, renting is throwing your money away. But you guys are both homeowners, right? You know, you throw money away owning a home, right? There's mortgage interest. There's, you know, things break. There's property tax. There's insurance. There's utilities. There's many, many things that add up. And so you have to kind of decide, how much money am I throwing away on this versus that? And in terms of the principal investment that you're making, what's the opportunity cost of? But
if you take, let me think through this here. If you take your home repair cost into the factor of your living cost and then say home is not an investment, aren't you just turning that argument around, saying I could take that money and invest it other places? Like, doesn't that kind of contradict? Because my theory or my thought is kind of halfway in between probably what the realtors are saying and what you're saying, which is we shouldn't look at our home as an investment. I don't think we should trade in for like you said, a smaller pair of boots, just to spend that extra money in our retirement. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to own a property so I don't have a massive rent payment when I do, or if I am able to retire, right? Like, that should be the goal, to pay down in the equity. Now, this is also for, let's call it 99%, 95% of people. They're not disciplined enough, or they don't make enough money, or they don't care enough to actually save otherwise. So it's a forced savings plan. And if everything does work out well, I think the best scenario is they just don't have a mortgage when they retire. Like, shouldn't that be the goal? so you can actually retire? Because there's not a lot of people that are going to be making more money in their retirement than when they're working, or at least in their last 10 years of working.
Sure, and I think that goes back to what's like a fundamental financial issue versus what's a cultural issue. Like maybe people could be more disciplined with their money, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people could be better informed of how they can use their money and how to be more disciplined with it. And for some people, that forced savings plan is going to be advantageous. And like I said, investing in a home it's an investment like a pair of boots. So you do want to maintain them. You want to spend some money to do that so that you're not actually losing the real physical value of it. And then, it does provide you with something of value down the line. I don't necessarily believe in the idea that it's kind of the be all end all and that's the ideal situation for everyone. And I think it would be better if we kind of rearranged how we view things to have more people understand that it's not an absolute necessity. Because I think the idea of like, if you don't own a home, your life is ruined forever, that has led to a lot of that FOMO that pushes prices up. And, in places like Europe, for example, a lot of people are lifelong renters, but they have more secure pension plans and, better options for subsidized housing or whatever. I mean, there's more systems in place that allow people to still do that securely, right? And it forms a mutually beneficial relationship between the landlord and the tenant. And those people still have, they're not going to be out on the street just because they're renting, and their rent payment is not going to be an incredibly massive burden. There's different ways we could get there, but I think part of it is going to be an unwinding of this idea that housing is like the best way to invest and generate wealth, and to the exclusion of almost everything else. Like I think,
right.
A lot of people have lost money playing the stock market or playing crypto, but that's because they're doing things like trading stocks, right? As opposed to buying and holding, right? If you were someone who was trying to make money on properties and you were buying and selling a property every week, right? You guys would probably say it's a bad idea, right?
Yeah, it would be.
You said properties, right? So you buy them and hold them for a long time.
Yeah.
And
the goal's forever.
The value out of that, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's the same way with stocks, is that you want to, again, it's the idea of like investing for value versus investing for speculation, which I think has crept into housing a lot, right? Is people are speculating on what the value of a home might be. Whereas if you're investing in a company, you shouldn't be, buying it and selling it a week or a month later. You should be buying it so that you can participate in the actual success of what that company is doing.
So here's where I have a lot of issue with the whole, because there's a lot of folks that do say, yes, we can invest in the stocks, but we can't invest in real estate. There's a lot of that. What's the difference? The difference is, if you're investing in a stock, I mean, you're hoping that other people want to buy that stock and it drives the price up. So realistically, I don't see any difference in it at all. Maybe there's a company that is producing things for sure, but you're not working for that company, right? You're not innovating for that company. You're propping up the valuation of that company, and in hopes that it's worth more, speculation, in the future. Unless it's a dividend stock, maybe it's only a dividend stock. But I see that as kind of a cop-out, personally. Like I don't view it as any different, because they say the Canadian housing market is like the bigger sucker theory. You just have to have somebody else pay more than you paid. A stock is absolutely no different, in my opinion. How can that be justified?
Well, I think you're right to some extent, right? This is a conversation I've had with people specifically about stocks versus real estate, but it was in the context of my criticism of real estate investing becoming price speculation in Canada. I mean, there is a legitimate form of real estate investing, which is probably closer to what you guys do, where you buy a property in order to rent it out for a profit, right? And so
a lot of people aren't making a profit these days, though. But yeah,
exactly, though, right? But if you have a property where you are actually making a decent cap rate on that property, right, where you actually you're providing some amount of service in terms of maintaining the property and doing all this other stuff, and then you extract a profit from that by covering your expenses and then some, then yes, that is a legitimate investment into a property, in the same way that investing in a stock in a business that makes profit is also a reasonable investment, right? Now, whether that profit is paid out as a dividend and then you get the money from that as income, or it is reinvested into the company, which then creates a reasonable, actual basis for the stock to increase in value, then I think that's good. Now, that's what we're doing with properties right now is more like what people do with stocks like Tesla or GameStop or something like that. They're really assuming that someone will pay more for it later. And again, one of my favorite articles that I've seen was it was like a Toronto condo investing company, and it was called "Winning in the Condo Market with Negative Cash Flow." And very appropriately, they use a stock photo of a chessboard with someone using their king to knock over the other person's king, and it's someone who obviously doesn't understand how the game of chess is played, which I think is a great photo for that article. But yeah, Steve, like you're not wrong, right? It's I think fundamentally investing in real estate and investing in stocks are kind of the same. It's just we need to refocus on doing value-based investing rather than speculative investing. And I think we've gotten to a place in Canada where, cap rates are ridiculously low for real estate in a lot of markets. They might be 2%, they might be 0%, they might be negative, and people are assuming that the increase in the equity of the property is going to outstrip those monthly losses. But an example I've given is, if you had a restaurant or any other business that was losing money every month, and then someone said, well, maybe you should close this business because it's not profitable. And then you said, well, the way I'm going to make profit is I'm going to sell this business to someone else for so much more money that I bought it for that it's going to erase all of those losses and I'm going to make a big profit.
Isn't
right?
that every tech company? Isn't that every single tech company?
Yeah, but that's neither here nor there. That's exactly how I see it, is that you're right, investing in properties is no different than investing in stocks. Other than that, it's a little less diversified. It tends to be more leveraged. There's, it's more hands-on, obviously. Like I think a lot of people think of rental income as passive income, but if you own a rental property, that it isn't, right? It's a small business that you're running.
Yeah, housing it's emotional. It's a different conversation. And that's why people get really frustrated about everything that's going on more than in the stock side of things, because they want somewhere to live, right? That's I think the core difference here, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, stocks to another extent, that's still people's jobs, people's livelihoods. People are, it's easier to switch jobs than it is to be forced out of your home, right? A layoff is not as big of a deal as a foreclosure or an eviction, I would say.
That's a good point. I wanted to wrap this up just by giving you some stats that I put together. Well, I didn't put together. I run polls on our community tab of our channel, which I love. Steve knows is like my favorite thing to do.
To be fair, we get at least half as many votes on these as they do in those, like when Manulife or RBC puts out a vote, they only get 1,000 votes as well. So we're halfway.
Hey, Millennial Moron, if you start putting out polls, do you get like a 5,000 votes? I think that'd be really interesting for you. Anyways, I just
do polls.
You can do polls on the YouTube community tab. It's awesome. Right. It's awesome. So I just said, what percentage of your net worth is in real estate? Just to our entire subscriber base. 0 to 25% was 27%. 25 to 50% of their total net worth was 14%. 50% to 75% was 30%, and 75% to 100% was 29%. So basically 59% of people that watch my main YouTube channel, more than 50% of their total net worth is in property. And I just find that interesting. It's not that surprising, I guess, if they've owned for a while, because that built the net worth because of the low interest rates.
That's not good, though, is it? To be that heavily invested in, I guess. The wrap up of this whole thing. Sorry to interrupt. The wrap up of this whole thing is like, it sounds like we're all saying, hey, maybe diversify a little bit. Maybe get a house that you can pay for. Maybe have a little bit of this. Maybe have a little bit of that. Maybe pay it down. Like, kind of be in the middle.
Yeah, naturally, your home's going to be kind of a startup cost in your overall finances, right? So it's going to be front loaded earlier on. I think, like one thing I've heard is the rule of 90, where your home equity plus your age as a percentage of your net worth should be 90 or less.
Oh, that's interesting. Wait, hold on. Let me think.
So
Oh,
if
no.
you're 40, you should have half or less, right?
You're the amount. Okay, yeah. Steve, what will yours be? Don't do math to us here.
Can't do math.
Yeah, this is just on your primary residence. You
Okay.
got other, yeah.
All right, I'm going to wrap this up with a very softball question for you. How many times is the Bank of Canada going to cut rates in 2024?
In 2024, I would say between 0 and 2, probably
Yeah.
2. That's
Two-
that's
two's
my guess
feeling-
right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what all the market is expecting. But of course, the market expectations are
Wrong, always.
wrong. So,
Steve, what do you think? I think you said 2 at the beginning of this year. You're going to stick with it?
I've been sticking with 2, and I don't think the first one is June. And we'll see. We'll see. I think we're going to get a July, and I think we're going to get one later in the year. And so far, I'm being proven right. All these April people, you lost.
I didn't know very many actual April people that were serious, though.
Every real estate agent in the country.
I said from the beginning, I said June, and I'm probably going to be wrong, but we'll see what happens here. Millennial Moron, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was fun. It was nice it was actually good that you and Steve had the banter back and forth there, because you can have like an open conversation about housing, having slightly different perspectives, and not yell at each other. And I think that's great. And I think we need more of this. So thanks for spending an hour with us, man.
yeah, thanks for having me. And I do think that is the key. I'm not out here saying that everything I'm saying is right. I'm saying, I've got this opinion. Here's why I think it. Think about it for yourself. And,
Yeah.
I'm not definitely right. I think we just need to have a more civil conversation about it and actually think about it rather than just making assumptions.
And for people,
And
sorry,
Tom,
Steve,
I'm here to say everything I say is right.
yeah, well, for people, I know obviously what you do for content wise is not your business, and you have a full-time job and things like that. But for anybody that was introduced to you for the first time today, I'm sure it's not that many people. A lot of people know who you are. Where's the best place? Like, do they go to YouTube, TikTok? Where would you send people first?
YouTube is my main focus right now, and I've got a lot of compilation videos of all my old TikTok stuff up there.
Okay.
But it's I think really just whatever is your preference. There's Millennial Moron on TikTok and on YouTube, millennial.moron on Instagram, and mil_moron on Twitter if you want to see more of what I'm thinking in the background.
That's awesome. Well, hey man, thanks for hanging out with us today. Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we will see you next week. Bye.